There was a moment in UFC history when one fighter didn't just dominate a division, she reshaped the entire sport. That fighter was Ronda Rousey, a woman so powerful, so marketable, and so relentlessly destructive that the UFC broke its own rules just to put her inside the octagon. In less than 4 years, she built a $50 million empire, carried the promotion into a new era, and became a global icon whose fights could sell out arenas before an opponent was even announced. She wasn't simply winning, she was ending world-class athletes in seconds, creating a level of fear and fascination the UFC had never seen in a female fighter. But behind the explosive finishes and Hollywood fame was a pressure far heavier than any championship belt. Rousey wasn't just the face of women's MMA, she was the product, the promise, and the profit model. Every headline praised her, every network wanted her, every young athlete trained because of her. And the UFC built an entire marketing empire on the belief that Ronda Rousey could not fall. Yet, on one night, one brutal, unforgettable night, everything collapsed. The aura of invincibility shattered, the empire cracked, and the woman who seemed untouchable lost everything under the brightest lights the sport had ever seen. This is the story of how a legend rose faster than any fighter in UFC history, and the truth behind how she lost it all in one night. Before she was the face of UFC, before the movie roles, magazine covers, and million-dollar paydays, Ronda Rousey was simply a quiet, fragile girl, growing up in a world that didn't allow weakness. Complications during her birth left her unable to form complete sentences until she was nearly 6 years old, a struggle that shaped the way she saw herself long before fame ever did. While other children learned through comfort, Ronda learned through survival, navigating a childhood marked by frustration, insecurity, and a silence she didn't yet know how to break. But the most devastating moment came when she was just 8. Her father, Ron Rousey, facing a hopeless medical condition, took his own life. That tragedy split her world in half. Overnight, childhood ended, and what remained was a deep, burning intensity that would follow her for decades. Her mother, Anne Maria DeMars, the first American to win a judo world championship, responded by raising her with a toughness that no ordinary child could endure. Training wasn't practice, it was war. Discipline wasn't encouraged, it was enforced. And from those brutal routines, something began to form inside Ronda, a willingness to push herself farther than anyone else in the room. Judo quickly became the only place where she felt understood. As a teenager, she left school behind and devoted every hour to mastering the art her mother had perfected. She was never the most polished fighter, never the cleanest technician, but she had something far more dangerous, a ferocity born from loss. That ferocity carried her all the way to the 2008 Beijing Olympics, where she won a bronze medal, becoming the first American woman in history to stand on the Olympic judo podium. The achievement was monumental, yet the reward was almost nothing. Judo paid poorly, fame was minimal, and by her early 20s, Ronda found herself broke, emotionally drained, and living in a small apartment without a clear future. But collapse often precedes reinvention. The UFC still refused to allow women to compete. Dana White had famously said, "Never." Yet when Ronda transitioned into MMA, she didn't arrive quietly. She arrived with a ruthlessness that forced people to watch. Her armbar became a weapon opponents feared more than any punch. In Strikeforce, she ended fights in seconds, her intensity so overwhelming that fans couldn't look away. By the time the UFC finally accepted women into the promotion, the decision wasn't philosophical, it was financial. Ronda Rousey had become too big to ignore. Her rise was fast, violent, and culturally seismic. And while the world believed it was witnessing the creation of a champion, something far more complicated and dangerous was forming behind that meteoric ascent. When Ronda Rousey stepped into the UFC for the first time, she wasn't just entering a new promotion, she was entering a vacuum. There had never been a female superstar. There had never been a woman who could headline an event, break ticket records, or carry an entire division on her back. But within months, Ronda became all of that at once. Her presence electrified the sport in a way even Dana White hadn't anticipated. He didn't just sign her. He built the women's division around her, giving her the inaugural UFC Women's Bantamweight Championship before she had even fought a single UFC bout. And from that moment, everything changed. Her first fight inside the octagon wasn't a contest, it was a statement. She finished Liz Carmouche in the first round, proving that the same violence she unleashed in Strikeforce wasn't a fluke. She wasn't just winning, she was annihilating opponents in 16 seconds, 14 seconds, 34 seconds. Numbers that turned into headlines, then memes, then marketing gold for the UFC. With every lightning-fast victory, Ronda became the center of a financial explosion. Pay-per-view numbers soared, arenas sold out in hours. Mainstream media, which once ignored MMA entirely, now put her on covers of ESPN, Sports Illustrated, and red carpets in Hollywood. The UFC had never seen anything like her. She wasn't just an athlete, she was an industry. Sponsors lined up. Talk shows fought for her appearance slots. Movie producers cast her in Fast and Furious 7, The Expendables 3, and major franchises that introduced her to audiences far beyond the octagon. For the first time in UFC history, a fighter wasn't just a fighter. She was a cultural phenomenon, and the money followed. Ronda's fight purses climbed into the high six figures, then seven. Her pay-per-view points brought in millions more. Endorsements stacked on top of film paychecks until analysts estimated her total earnings at over $50 million, an unimaginable figure for a female fighter just a few years earlier. She had become exactly what the UFC needed: a marketing engine, an unstoppable champion, and the most profitable face of a rapidly expanding empire. But success, especially this much, this fast, comes with a gravitational pull. And as Hollywood embraced her and fans elevated her into something mythic, another force began to take shape beneath the surface. Every interview, every magazine cover, every knockout created an invisible tension. The higher she climbed, the more catastrophic the fall would be. Because behind the power of her armbar and the millions her name generated, something dangerous was happening. Something the UFC could see but could no longer control. As Ronda Rousey's fame surged past anything the UFC had ever seen, something subtle but irreversible began to take shape. Success had never come gently to her. Every victory was violent, emphatic, and fast, and the world quickly decided that anything less than perfection from Ronda was failure. She wasn't just winning, she was expected to obliterate opponents. And that expectation, repeated under the brightest lights in combat sports, became a weight even she struggled to carry. The pressure didn't just come from fans. The media began shifting its tone. Magazine covers that once celebrated her dominance now questioned her temperament. Analysts dissected her technique with unusually sharp confidence, pointing out that her striking remained unpolished, that she relied too heavily on the armbar, that her footwork lacked refinement. Rivals amplified those doubts, claiming the UFC had built Ronda into a myth, a carefully protected investment rather than an unbeatable champion. Whether those criticisms were fair or not didn't matter. They stuck. And then came the fame beyond fighting. Hollywood, with its seductive spotlight, consumed more of her energy than she admitted. Filming schedules, press tours, red carpets, all while trying to maintain the intensity of a champion's training camp. Few fighters in history had been asked to balance two worlds at once, and none had been asked to do it while carrying the entire financial momentum of the UFC's women's division. Behind the scenes, those closest to Ronda saw something shifting. The confidence that once fueled her began to tilt towards something more dangerous: invulnerability. She no longer saw opponents as threats, but as obstacles. She dismissed critics as jealous or uninformed. She brushed aside strategic concerns from coaches who warned that her striking defense needed urgent improvement. To Ronda, the only truth was that she had never truly been tested, and therefore she had nothing to fear. But the warning signs were everywhere. During the build-up to her fight with Holly Holm, Ronda appeared more agitated, more distracted, and more strained than ever before. Tensions with her longtime coach, Edmond Tarverdian, grew harder to ignore. Training footage showed a fighter heavily overworked, emotionally drained, and carrying the burden of an entire empire. For the first time since joining the UFC, she looked tired. Yet the public narrative remained the same. Ronda Rousey is unstoppable, and Ronda believed it. She believed it so completely that she walked into Fight Week with the confidence of someone who had forgotten that every empire has limits. She ignored critics, underestimated Holm, and treated the matchup as a formality instead of a threat. What she didn't know, what almost no one inside the UFC fully understood, was that Holly Holm had studied every flaw Ronda refused to see, and in a matter of minutes, Holm would weaponize those flaws in front of the largest audience Ronda had ever faced. The cracks in the crown had already formed. The fall was no longer a question of if, but when. On November 14, 2015, at UFC 193 in Melbourne, Australia, more than 56,000 fans packed into Etihad Stadium to witness what everyone believed would be another effortless demolition by Ronda Rousey. She walked into the arena as the undefeated queen of MMA, the face of the UFC, the biggest star in combat sports, a fighter so dominant that bookmakers didn't bother pretending the fight was competitive. The odds against Holly Holm were astronomical. The narrative was already written. The world came to watch greatness continue. But from the moment the bell rang, it was clear that the script was wrong. Holm wasn't intimidated, wasn't overwhelmed, and wasn't fooled by the myth that had crushed every opponent before her. While Ronda charged forward with aggressive pressure, Holm stayed calm, calculating, and perfectly disciplined. Each time Ronda rushed in, Holm stepped aside, landing clean countershots that snapped Ronda's head back, and more importantly, snapped the illusion of invincibility the world had accepted as fact. For the first time in her UFC career, Ronda looked lost, not beaten, but bewildered. Her footwork unraveled. Her defense vanished. Her expressions shifted from confidence to panic as Holm exposed every weakness critics had tried to warn about. Ronda kept pressing, but with every missed punch, every failed clinch attempt, the energy began draining from her body like air leaking from a tire. She wasn't fighting Holm anymore. She was fighting the weight of her own legend. And then came the moment that broke the sport open. Early in the second round, after Ronda stumbled forward off balance, Holm stepped to the side with chilling precision and unleashed a left high kick that connected with the force of a hammer. The stadium erupted as Ronda fell backward, collapsing to the canvas in a moment that echoed around the world. Holm followed with strikes, but the fight was already over. The reign was already dead. The referee stepped in, and just like that, the unstoppable champion was no longer unstoppable. The reaction was immediate and seismic. Social media exploded. News outlets published headlines within minutes. Fans who once worshipped Ronda now questioned whether she had ever been as dominant as they believed. The UFC, which had built its global momentum on her invincibility, watched the empire tremble in real time. But the most devastating impact was internal. As medics escorted her out of the arena, her face swollen and her spirit shattered, Ronda Rousey disappeared from the public eye. Interviews were canceled. Appearances were erased. She retreated into silence, revealing later that the loss had become so overwhelming that she had contemplated ending her life. The world thought she had only lost a fight. In truth, she had lost her identity. The idea of herself that had carried her from childhood trauma to global superstardom. And yet, the story didn't end in Melbourne. The UFC needed her comeback almost as desperately as she needed redemption. But the Ronda who would return months later was not the same fighter. And the opponent waiting for her, Amanda Nunes, would deliver a second blow even more brutal than the first. After the devastation of UFC 193, the world waited to see whether Ronda Rousey would return. and if she did, whether she could ever be the same. For more than a year, she vanished. No interviews, no media tours, no public explanations. The woman who once commanded global attention slipped into silence, carrying a wound far deeper than a knockout. But the UFC couldn't allow its biggest star to fade. Pay-per-view numbers had dipped, momentum had slowed, and the promotion desperately needed a revival. So they crafted a comeback, not just a fight, but a resurrection, and presented it as the greatest return story in MMA history. On December 30th, 2016 at UFC 207, Ronda stepped back into the octagon. But something unmistakable had changed. She refused to speak at press conferences, skipped promotional responsibilities, and isolated herself from the media entirely. The silence was marketed as focus. In reality, it was evidence of a fighter still broken, still fragile, still unsure whether she belonged in a cage she once ruled. And standing across from her was the worst possible opponent for a wounded legend. Amanda Nunes, the newly crowned bantamweight champion, a destroyer whose power was unlike anyone Ronda had ever faced. From the opening seconds, it was clear this wasn't a comeback. It was an execution. Nunes struck with brutal precision, landing punch after punch that sent Ronda stumbling, blinking, frozen between instinct and shock. The woman who once walked through storms now looked overwhelmed by a breeze. 48 seconds after the fight began, the referee stepped in, ending not just the bout, but the era. The arena watched in stunned silence as the once invincible queen was reduced to a spectral version of herself, unable to defend, unable to respond, unable to understand how completely the sport had moved past her. The UFC promotion machine, which had spent years building Ronda into an empire, suddenly had nothing left to promote. There was no standing ovation, no farewell speech, no announcement of retirement. Only a hollow exit as Ronda walked backstage, eyes blank, knowing that the world she built had collapsed completely. In that moment, her $50 million empire didn't vanish financially, but it vanished symbolically. The aura, the myth, the dominance, all gone. Days later, the UFC quietly shifted its focus toward Amanda Nunes, Valentina Shevchenko, Rosa Namajunas, and the new generation of fighters who would define women's MMA. For the first time since she arrived, Ronda was no longer the center of anything, and she knew it. She left the sport without a word, transitioned into WWE, and tried to rebuild a new identity far away from the cage that had made and destroyed her. Yet the truth behind the fall is more complicated than two losses. Ronda didn't just lose fights. She lost the psychological armor that once made her invincible. The empire collapsed not because she wasn't great, but because greatness built on perfection leaves no room for survival when perfection breaks. Ronda Rousey wasn't defeated by Holm or Nunes alone. She was defeated by the impossible expectations that came with being the first of her kind. And that is what sets the stage for the legacy she left behind. A legacy shaped not only by victory, but by the cost of carrying an entire sport on her shoulders. When the story of Ronda Rousey is told years from now, it will never be remembered as a tale defined by two losses. It will be remembered as the rise of a woman who changed the architecture of an entire sport. Before Ronda, the idea of women headlining a UFC event was unthinkable. After Ronda, it became normal, expected, profitable, celebrated. She didn't just open the door, she ripped it off the hinges and forced an industry to evolve. The fighters who dominate today, champions like Amanda Nunes, Valentina Shevchenko, Zhang Weili, and many others, are standing on a foundation she built with sweat, pressure, and impossible expectations. Her victories created a myth. Her collapse turned that myth into a warning. And together, they shaped one of the most unforgettable arcs in combat sports history. Because greatness isn't defined by perfection. It's defined by the ability to transform a landscape, even if you don't survive the transformation yourself. The world watched Ronda Rousey rise like a comet, burning brighter than any star the UFC had ever produced. And the world watched her fall, suddenly, violently, painfully, under lights that exposed every vulnerability she had spent years outrunning. But even in that fall, her influence refused to disappear. PPV numbers changed because of her. Marketing models changed because of her. The global perception of women in combat sports changed because of her. Her $50 million empire may have cracked in one night, but the impact she left behind will outlive every headline and every knockout. Some fighters win belts, some fighters break records. Only a few redefine the sport. Ronda was one of them, flawed, fierce, unforgettable. And in the end, that raises a question that will echo long after her final walkout. If Ronda Rousey had never risen and never fallen, would the UFC be the same sport we know today?